Hi, class. Chapter 14 discusses social relationships, and most importantly, family and peers. And we begin our discussion with a talk about the different types of living arrangements that adults may have and decisions about family formation, having children, the blending of families, so step families, and how this affects children and adults in different ways. So beginning with singlehood. A person is defined as single if they're not currently living with a romantic partner. So, singlehood is the most common in US adults, and about half of single adults say that they would like to get married in the future, though. So, it's not always necessarily by choice, but it could be because that's what currently works right now, or because they're not quite ready to begin a relationship, or they haven't really found the right person just yet. Females are more likely than males to remain single for many years or their entire lives. Females tend to select mates who are the same age or older, are equally or better educated, and are professionally successful. Now, because of these tendencies, highly educated women who are financially independent and therefore lack an economic incentive to marry may find fewer potential mates whom they consider suitable. There are several factors associated with being single by choice, those who choose to not be in a committed relationship. They tend to be more self supporting, feel a sense of control over their romantic lives, and they sometimes just haven't encountered anyone who they wish to marry. They tend to enjoy singlehood and the freedom to take risks and experiment with lifestyle changes. People who are single, they don't really have the ties to be locked down, and so they can do more spontaneous things and also make more risky decisions like trying a new job or moving to a new town, whereas that would be more difficult for a person with an established relationship and family. The chart on the slide shows the reasons why people give for the reasons people give for not being married by age. So we see that those who are 18 to 24, their most common reason is just they're not ready to settle down yet and they feel too young. Those who are 25 to 34, their most common reason is that they're not yet financially prepared. And those who are aged 35 and older, their most likely reason is that they just haven't found who they're looking for just yet. Cohabitation is the term that we use to describe the living arrangement of unmarried couples sharing a home. This is very common in the United States and is becoming increasingly common in older adults too. More than half of young adults in their 20s have lived with a romantic partner, and about two-thirds of US couples live together before their marriage. The rates of cohabitation among adults over 50 have more than doubled since 2000. And you can see a figure on the slide that shows the rates of cohabitation by country. Now, some of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in older adulthood is sometimes due to financial reasons, that it just makes sense to live with someone, to share rent, to share finances. Sometimes they may be in a relationship and not get married because this can allow them to still use some government-funded health care. It may be that they're just looking for someone for companionship, not quite ready to take the dive into marriage. So a few varying reasons. Now, in terms of cohabitation in general, not just older adults, there are several reasons why people decide to cohabitate. There may be changes in employment or a housing situation, just the convenience of living together. It may be in response to a pregnancy, an unintended pregnancy, and so rather than just get married and move in, they just decide to take the step of moving in to help co-parent the child. They may still be assessing their romantic compatibility, just not quite sure if this is the person who they want to be with forever. They may see a potential improvement in finances. It's a lot more affordable to live in one bedroom as compared to two bedrooms, and it's easier to share one bedroom with a partner as opposed to a roommate. And this may also just be viewed as an alternative to marriage. We are starting to see a bit of a decline or a small trend towards marriage being less frequent, and part of that is in response to divorce having been so frequent. So it's almost like this, for some individuals, they may be kind of disillusioned and not too hopeful about marriage, and why even matter, or why think about it. So we will talk about that again when we get to issues of divorce, because sometimes this can be in response to a child growing up in a house where their parents had lots of conflict, had divorce, or went through multiple relationships. Now, cultural differences in the acceptability of cohabitation. Many European countries see cohabitation as an alternative to marriage, that this is just a different lifestyle, it's a different arrangement. And in Canada, cohabitating couples are afforded some of the same rights as married couples after 1 to 3 years. So there really isn't a legal difference in Canada once they've been together for that period of time. And some cultures have almost no cohabitation. So in Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Philippines, those are just some of the countries where cohabitation is almost never seen. Now, in terms of the stability of cohabitating unions, couples who live together without being married, how stable is that relationship? Are they likely to stay together? Well, research has shown that couples who cohabitate in the United States tend to be less satisfied, show higher rates of intimate violence, and have less stable relationships than married couples. In the US, cohabitating couples who get married later tend to have unhappier marriages and are more likely to divorce. Now, that's not to say that cohabitation causes less happiness or causes instability in relationships. It's also important to note that there's a certain type of person who is drawn to the idea of cohabitation, and they may see marriage as a more flexible thing and divorce as more acceptable anyways. So because of that, it might be more the personality or the value system that leads to these more negative outcomes as compared to, and not necessarily the cohabitation that causes these marital problems later. Marriage rates have declined to record lows, yet nearly all adults in the United States will marry at some time in their life. The median age at first marriage in the United States is 27 for women and 29 for men. And the chart on the slide shows this age at marriage across time. And so we see that, way back in the 1890s, early 1900s, women typically got married before the age of 22 on average. And for men, it was younger than 26 or even younger than 25 on average. And we're seeing this spike in the age at first marriage, really beginning around 1970, a bit with the women's liberation movement and women moving into more of a working position. And we see that these averages are higher than they have been previously. Now, there are a lot of benefits to marriage. Those who are married tend to live longer, they tend to be happier, they're physically healthier, wealthier, and in better mental health. So overall, we do see a positive association with many good outcomes for those who are married. Now, the question, what will predict if someone is going to be happy and satisfied in their marriage? What will predict if this marriage will last, and as opposed to end in divorce? Well, one of the best predictors is the partner's chronological maturity or age. Generally, the younger the bride and groom, the less likely they are to have a lifelong marriage. Also, the degree of similarity between the members of the couple. Similarities in socioeconomic status, education, religion, and age, they all contribute to a happy marriage. So similarity and also older age is related to marriages being likely to last longer. Now, there are gender differences in satisfaction of marriage. Men generally report being happier with their marriages than women. Men are more likely to be surprised by a spouse wanting a divorce than women are. Marital satisfaction, it's important to note that it waxes and wanes across decades, that marital satisfaction is not necessarily stable, it's not necessarily volatile, but then it's more like waves that come and go, where you can have greater satisfaction during some periods of your life and then sometimes have months or years of lower marital satisfaction. So it can have that ebb and flow type look to it. In older adulthood, marriage is characterized by greater satisfaction, less negativity, and more positive interactions. Older adults who are married are also less likely to have conflict in their marriage. They show higher levels of pleasure in their marriage and more positive affect, more positive emotions. So marriage in older adulthood tends to be associated with those positive outcomes and positive features. Intimate relationships and marriage appear to have similar meanings for gay and lesbian couples as compared with heterosexual couples. There are also similar benefits of relationships for homosexual couples as there are for heterosexual couples. There's no differences in the love, the satisfaction, or a partner's evaluations of the strengths and weaknesses of the relationship. Serious problems do exist sometimes in both types of relationships, and the breakup rate is similar for both types of couples. So really there's not much significant difference in homosexual couples as there are for heterosexual couples. Now, the stressors that gay men and lesbian women face, such as the experience of stigma and prejudice, may play a role in how same-sex marriage manifests in health and psychological well-being. Legal marriage might have the potential to offset the mental health impact of these stressors at the individual level, and might offset the larger macro level effects of sanctioned discrimination. So having a legal marriage and feeling established and feeling like you have legitimacy can help to overcome some of the discrimination that an individual may feel at the individual level. And the figure on the slide shows rates of support of same-sex marriage across time. And we see that there has been a general trend of increasing favoring. So being favor and approve of same-sex marriage. And you see it broken down by generation. So by far the younger generation that's represented here, millennials, we actually don't see Gen Z on this chart, but millennials, those who are born 1981 to about 1981 to roughly, I want to say it's around 2004, something like that. So millennials have been the generation that is most approving and most favoring of same-sex marriage. And second to that is Generation X. And then third is baby boomers. And before that is the silent generation. So we're seeing a clear trend that approval for same-sex marriage is increasing, especially generationally, with younger generations being more accepting of same-sex marriages. The United States has one of the highest divorce rates in the world. And following the 1960s, divorce rates tripled, but have since stabilized and even declined a little bit. So even though you may think that divorce rates are at their absolute peak, that marriage is doomed, actually we've seen a little bit of a decrease in divorce rates. But this also is a reflection of some decrease in actual marriage rates as well. People are kind of choosing cohabitation and other lifestyles. So the question of who is more likely to get divorced? Do we have predictors of divorce? Will my marriage end up in divorce or will we stay together? Now, there are several factors that have been found to be associated with divorce. Those who have lower education are at an economic disadvantage. Those who aren't religious, which may be a reflection of them seeing divorce as not necessarily a sin, so maybe it's more permissible to do. And those who experience multiple life stressors and role overload, so just taking on too much and putting themselves in different roles, this is all associated with an increased risk of divorce. And parental divorce absolutely does influence children's view of marriage. And this is something that you may have heard other people reflect upon, that because their parents fought and got divorced, that maybe now they don't value the institution of marriage and they don't want to get married themselves. Some people respond in that way. The number and quality of parental relationships is related towards children's attitudes towards marriage, their relationship skills, and their likelihood of divorce when they grow older. So if a child grew up in a household where their mother had, many boyfriends or many relationships, or their father did, and if their parents divorced or they experienced many divorces, then they are likely to have a negative attitude about marriage, and sometimes feel more comfortable with the idea of divorce because it's familiarity, it's what they've known. Now, a critical predictor of divorce is a couple's communication and problem-solving style. It's negative interaction patterns and difficulty regulating discussions that predicts later divorce. So it's so important for couples to go and seek couples counseling and try to improve that communication in order to help mend the relationship and avoid that pathway to divorce. Now, the process of divorce is a series of stressful experiences. It's not just one day that you file the divorce papers and that's it. There's conflicts leading up to it. There's a physical separation that sometimes even starts before the paperwork is filed. There's the decision of who moves to where, who takes the kids, and who takes what property. And this can be quite a bit of negotiation and conflict that's difficult for all family members. And they may feel a confusing array of emotions. Just because a person initiates the divorce and asks for it doesn't mean that it's an easy transition for them. And they can absolutely still have lots of negative feelings and difficult times, even if they were the ones who asked for the divorce. Now, divorce is linked with decreased life satisfaction, heightened risk of illness, early death, and most people who go through a divorce, even though they go through, they are more likely to have these negative outcomes, they generally fare well. There is this resiliency that many people experience, and many people end up remarrying as well. So just because it can negatively impact a person's life, generally they can get through it, and often they can still establish subsequent relationships after that. Now, moving on to having children. Childbearing rates have declined in most industrial nations, and this is primarily due to effective methods of birth control, but then also changing cultural views on parenthood and childlessness. It used to be kind of this idea that it's just a woman's job to have children and to raise children. So this means that once we have a changing cultural concept of what is an acceptable role for a woman, that she may not feel so pressured to have kids. It's more acceptable for her to delay having children or maybe choose to not have children at all. It doesn't necessarily define her. Most married adults do become parents, but it's becoming later and later in life. The average age at which the women in the United States give birth has increased, and we see this shown at the figure on the slide. So looking back at 1970, the average age at which children gave birth is at 21.4, and now it's all the way up at 26.4, and that's in 2014. So it's possible that it's increased even in the past few years. Now, the transition to parenthood does bring just a host of new responsibilities and changes. Many new parents report not feeling prepared for this roller coaster of emotion that accompanies parenthood. It's often described as being the hardest job, but the most rewarding job is being a parent. And it can involve a lot of self-sacrifice, the need for a lot of patience, but then can also have a big emotional payoff for those who enjoy it. Now, this does place a lot of stress even on the best of marriages. Parenthood is associated with sudden declines in marital satisfaction, and this is even greater for women than for men. This is usually because women are more typically the ones who have a change in their lifestyle. So if they were, working and having frequent outings with their friends, once they have a baby and they're the ones who are breastfeeding and taking care of the child, this may mean that they have to cut back on their work hours, that they can no longer go out with friends and have the social life that they wanted, and they're spending a lot more time at home taking care of the child. And for many women, this is a huge, major transition and can be very difficult. Sometimes you will hear those who are staying at home with the children say that they just want an adult conversation. And so it can be very, very difficult to deal with. And men are more likely to stay at work and sometimes even take on more hours. So there may be a bit more work stress there and stress on being a provider, but they are still permitted to have this life and have adult conversations outside of being home with a child, which means that they're less likely to experience some of this negativity. We also see an issue with parents who are transitioning to having a child, and there's often this shift in roles. So whereas fathers before were helping out a bit more with the house and cooking and cleaning and whatnot, once the mom stays home and is no longer working, then that responsibility may shift to her. And there may be some resentment of her feeling like she's doing everything at home and taking care of the kids, and then the dad feeling like he's, out working all day and just wants some peace and quiet when he gets home. So that shift in responsibilities can sometimes add some stressors as well. Now, there are some adults who remain without children for their life, or for a great majority of their life. And this may be due to infertility, the inability to conceive a child, or because they're intentionally postponing parenthood. So, they can be in their 30s and still not have a child. And then there are also some who are childless by choice. So a few reasons there. Now, the figure on the slide shows the rates of impaired fecundity. So this means the inability to become pregnant or to carry a fetus to term. And we see that this increases with age. So it becomes more difficult for a woman to have a child as she grows older. And this is especially difficult for females who have not given birth before. Females who have been pregnant before, their body does not show as much of a decline in fertility. Now, involuntary childlessness is associated with life dissatisfaction and lower psychological well-being. These are people who want to have children and are unable to conceive a child. And some of you may think, well, just go out and adopt, but that too can be incredibly expensive and difficult and stressful. So it's not always easy for someone to obtain a child and become a parent. Now, those who are childless by choice, we refer to them as being child-free. And they may choose this lifestyle because of the desire for flexibility and freedom from childcare responsibility. Maybe they want to pursue their career aspirations without having to worry about, missing a work day to take care of sick children. Maybe they do it for economic reasons. They've also reported environmental reasons, not wanting to contribute to overpopulation, and also that they want to preserve their marital satisfaction, that they feel like if they have children, it will add all of these stressors to their marriage and will result in them not spending as much time with their partner and adding all the stress, and that they'll grow apart perhaps. So they're really worried about the conflict and separation that children can cause within a marriage. So those who choose to be child-free are more likely to have higher education and also be established in a career. So they choose that lifestyle and prioritize education and other relationships above having children. So moving on to different family constellations. The first type of family that we'll talk about are single parent families. So this is when there's, say, only one dad and no mom present in the family, or only mom is there and dad has left. Over 1/4 of the United States children live with a single parent. Most commonly, it's with their mother. And ethnic minority children are disproportionately likely to live in a single parent home. That's what the figure on the slide shows, is the rates of living arrangements over time. And we see that living with one's mother only has increased over time, and living with two married parents has decreased over time. Living with no parent and with father only hasn't really shown much of an increase. Now, generally, children in single parent families tend to show more problems. More physical and mental health problems, poorer academic achievement, less social competence, and more behavioral problems. But it's important to note that these effects tend to be small. So even though we may see differences in kids who come from single parent families versus other constellations, these differences and the negative outcomes, they're not huge differences. Now, they do often lack economic and social resources. Children in single mother homes, regardless of ethnicity, are disproportionately likely to live in poverty. The next family constellation is a cohabitating family. So cohabitating families are on the rise. It's about 40% of children that will spend some time living in cohabitating parent family before age 12. So these are families who are not married, but the parents are living together. Now, a challenge of cohabitation is that relationships of unmarried cohabitating couples tend to be less stable than those of married couples. About 1/3 of cohabitating couples break up within 3 years. Now, the children are much more likely to experience their parents' separation. There tends to be more conflict in the home and more transitions in family life when it is a cohabitating couple as opposed to a married couple. However, it's important to note that cohabitation varies with contextual norms. Cohabitating unions are more common among minority families, and these children are less negatively impacted than white children by living with parents who are cohabitating as opposed to parents who are married. Now, moving on to same-sex parented families, so a family who has two mothers or two fathers. About 37% of LGBT, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, LGBT identified adults, about 37% of them have a child at some point in their lives. Now, research has failed to reveal important differences in the adjustment or development of these children. It turns out that these kids and teens raised by same-sex couples as compared to those raised by with a mother and a father, that there just really isn't that much difference in their outcomes and their development. There's no difference in emotional development. They show the same amount of empathy and emotion regulation. Now, children raised by gay and lesbian parents may score higher in some aspects of social and academic competence, and also may show fewer social and behavioral problems and lower levels of aggression as compared to children raised by heterosexual parents. And it's important to note that they're not more likely to display a gay orientation in adulthood. So having two mothers or two fathers is not going to turn a child gay. That's absolutely not what we find. Divorce is a common transition that many children experience and poses quite a few challenges to adjustment. Research has suggested that divorce has some negative effects on children's adjustment, such as internalizing and externalizing problems, but that the effects are small, they vary by particular outcome. Often these effects are transient, meaning they don't last for long, and they definitely don't apply to all children uniformly. We do see some gender differences in response to divorce. So boys, they more often respond with increases in behavior problems and delinquent activities. They're more likely to act out. Girls, they tend to respond with anxiety and depression. So they're more likely to turn this angst inwards. Most tend to show improved adjustment within 2 years after divorce. Now, divorce is not a discrete event. It's a transition. This is a process that influences living arrangements, housing, income, family roles, and it begins even before the divorce is announced. There's often tension and increased conflict leading up to a divorce. So this is a long process, sometimes years long. Parental conflict is the element that is most harmful to children and can begin to negatively impact a child even 8 or 10 years before the divorce. Parental conflict impairs children's emotional, psychological, and behavioral adaptation, and this predicts poor long-term outcomes and adjustment difficulties. Now, divorce triggers a reconfiguration of family roles. Parenting responsibilities shift disproportionately to the resident parent, meaning where the child lives most often. So if the child lives with the mother during the weekdays and the father during the weekends, then the mom takes on quite a bit of the burden of much of the responsibility of taking care of the child. So this is usually the mother that has this extra burden. Children tend to have decreased contact with non-custodial fathers. So if fathers don't have custody, then that, they just don't see them as often, and that relationship tends to drift and fade. So this divorce can also lead to a drop in income. So if fathers are now only required to give a small amount of child support, This is often much less support than what the father and mother were getting, or what the child and the mother were getting when they were actually married. So instead of being supported by the father, he pays for rent, he pays for utilities, maybe she contributes income too, but then that's all taken away. And maybe now he's only required to pay $200 or $300 a month. It's a huge difference. So this drop in income is disproportionately affecting women, which means that they and their children have less access to resources like after school programs, and they may have to move to poorer and more violent neighborhoods. Mothers may have to increase the number of hours they work, and they may be at a pay disadvantage if they've been out of the workforce. They may have less contact with their children and be less able to monitor their activities and follow family routines. So that can be really disruptive to the family. Parenting styles and parent-child interactions often shift in response to a divorce. Parents may feel less effective in monitoring and disciplining their children and experience more conflict and less cohesion in their relationships with their children. So this can have a really significant impact. A blended family is a family composed of a biological parent and a non-related adult, so most commonly a mother and a stepfather. Step families, this is also referred to as a step family, or a reconstituted family is another term for it. Now, there are multiple transitions entailed by divorce and remarriage, and these transitions are stressful. It's often difficult to integrate and balance the many relationships. So, for example, some families may need to go to 4 Thanksgivings and 4 Christmases. So, for example, go to uh, uh, the step parents' family's house, and dad's families and mom's families and the other stepdad's families. And so you could have so many different Christmases and so many different Thanksgivings that it can be really stressful. Some children and adults look back and find the remarriage of their parents as more stressful than the divorce itself. So that takes quite a toll on these families. Age does influence adaptation to the blended family. School-age children and adolescents tend to display more difficulties in adjusting to remarriage than do young children. Now, those who adapt successfully to blended families, what contributes to the successful adaptation to this blending is factors like when step-parents build a warm friendship with a child, when they adopt their new roles slowly rather than rushing or forcing relationships. So don't automatically act like the father or act like the mother, but slowly take on these roles and slowly carry out some of those parenting behaviors. And how well adults adjust to the role of the step-parent is influenced by the support of the biological parent, as well as children's perception of their relationship with the step-parent and willingness to accept that adult into the family. Now, parenting style is the emotional climate of the parent-child relationship. It influences parents' feelings of efficacy, how effective their parenting is, their relationship with their children, and children's development. This is displayed as an enduring set of parenting behaviors, and we see 2 primary dimensions of warmth and acceptance. And then the other dimension is setting boundaries and how they carry out discipline. And the way that they have warmth and also set boundaries, this is fairly consistent across situations, and this is what creates child rearing climates. The table on this slide shows the 4 parenting styles and the typical behavior associated with them. So sometimes this is represented instead of a table or a list like this, it may be listed more like a 2x2, with authoritative parenting being high on warmth and high on control, authoritarian being low on warmth, high on control, permissive, high on warmth, low on control, and indifferent or negligent is low and low on both. So it's the different combinations of either being high or being low on warmth and also on control. But the one elaboration that we have here is that authoritative and authoritarian parents have slightly different ways of actually carrying out that control. Authoritative parents give firm, consistent uh, boundaries and requirements of their children, but then couple that with discussion. So there's a little bit more of a democracy where they're listening to their children's needs. They're warm in the way that they carry out this discipline, and then they discuss why they're needing the child to do a particular behavior. Whereas authoritarian is more the type of, do this because I say so. They're not discussing it. They just demand this particular behavior and then carry out swift punishment if the child doesn't conform to what the parent wants. So let's go over each of these parenting categories a bit more. So authoritarian parents, they emphasize behavioral control and obedience over warmth. So they expect their children to conform to parent standards without question. Do this because I say so. And when they don't follow these directions, they give forceful and sometimes even arbitrary punishments. They're very punitive, and that can cause some hostility and aggression in the child. They tend to be less supportive and warm. So they're not, oh, come here and tell me about why you're upset. They just say, shut up, I don't want to hear about it, do what I say. Children raised by authoritarian parents tend to have problems. They tend to be withdrawn, mistrustful, and anxious, yet at the same time angry. So they're kind of like giving up. They've always been told, do what I say because I say so. And so they're anxious about getting in trouble, and then they feel like they don't have any control over the situation. They show more behavioral problems and also are more disruptive with peers and react out with hostility. Permissive parents are warm and accepting and can even consider to be a bit indulgent in their children's wants and desires. They really let children be free spirits and kind of run amok and give them whatever they want and make sure that their emotional needs are taken care of and emphasize self-expression, but they really have no rules and very few expectations for their children's behavior. So these are often the kids who are kind of running amok in a restaurant, disrupting everyone's meals, and the parents aren't really doing anything about it. So autonomy is not granted gradually and in a developmentally appropriate way. Kids are just allowed to kind of do whatever they want to do. So there are also negative developmental outcomes for the permissive parenting style. And those kids don't really learn how to control their emotions and behave appropriately. So they can also have some acting out of aggression and difficulty with relationships because of that. Parents who are uninvolved or neglectful, they may focus on their own needs rather than those of the child. And it may be because they're under a lot of stress, they're just emotionally detached from their child, maybe they're depressed, or they just don't have the time or the energy to really pay attention to the child and kind of carry out these parenting behaviors. So they really don't give much support or warmth, and they also don't really control their child much. They don't recognize children's needs for affection and direction, and they kind of just let the child be and do what they want to do, but then they don't meet their emotional needs either. So there are negative consequences for children's development across the board: cognitive, emotional, social, and even physical. These are neglected children. They didn't really get that warm, loving, caring parent who wants to be with them and interact with them. So we see a wide array of negative outcomes. Authoritative parenting involves being warm and sensitive to children's needs, but also firm in expectations that children are expected to have appropriate standards for behavior, that you're not just running up and down the aisles of a restaurant or a church, that it's important that you behave appropriately, and that there are, consequences to one's behavior, but then those consequences are explained in an appropriate way. So they engage the child in discussions about standards of behavior and grant children developmentally appropriate levels of autonomy. So they do give them some independence and ability to act out on their own, but only in ways that it's developmentally appropriate. When a rule is violated, they explain what the child did wrong, and they impose limited, developmentally appropriate punishments that are closely connected to the misdeed. So they give consequences that are clear, that are firm, and that make sense in the child's mind. And this type of parenting is related to several positive developmental outcomes. Children are more likely to have a higher confidence and self-esteem, better social skills. They tend to be more curious and achieve more academically. They also have higher executive function, the ability to think of consequences and control one's emotions and inhibit their behaviors as appropriate. Now, the effects of parenting styles vary widely with culture and contextual factors. In non-Western collectivistic cultures, there are few negative outcomes of authoritarian parenting. So whereas in Western cultures, authoritarian parenting is related to kind of aggression and disrupted interactions with peers, and these other negative outcomes, you don't see that with authoritarian parenting and non-Western collectivistic cultures. And this may possibly be because non-Western cultures tend to place less emphasis on autonomy and identity and more on dependence and connection with to family. So these characteristics are consistent with authoritarian parenting. Do what I say because I say so, because it's important for the family. And that makes sense in that particular cultural context. Now, moving on to parent-child relationships, conflict between parents and children, and also monitoring of children's behaviors. Conflict between parents and adolescents tends to rise in early adolescence. Conflict peaks in middle adolescence and then declines a little bit, and generally just involves innocuous, kind of harmless bickering over mundane matters. Generally, we see a continuity in parent-child relationships. So if there was a pattern of harsh verbal discipline and insensitive parenting in early childhood, this tends to persist and even worsen in middle childhood and adolescence. Most adolescents and parents do actually have a warm, close, communicative relationship. From middle childhood into adolescence, parents must adapt their parenting strategies to children's increased ability to reason and also their desire for independence. One really important parenting challenge is to offer increasing opportunities for adolescents to develop and practice autonomy, doing things on their own, while also providing protection from danger and the consequences of poor decisions. So maybe you can let your child go out with their friends unsupervised, but you still need to monitor, where they're going and who they're going to be with, and then teach them how to identify, what areas may be dangerous or what situations may be dangerous and what to do about that. Parental monitoring is defined as being aware of teens' whereabouts and also their companions. And monitoring is associated with less risky behavior in adolescence. So it really is beneficial for parents to actually follow up and pay attention to who their kids are with and where they're going. Now, moving out of the family home is an important experience for parents and children. It marks the adolescent's entry into adulthood and independent living. Most parents adjust well to the transition, although mothers do report the move as more stressful than fathers. So becoming an empty nester is more difficult for mothers than fathers. Now, it is increasingly common for children to return home at some point in their 20s, and this is often referred to as boomerang adult children. So they leave and then they come right back. This is associated with lower psychological well-being among mothers. And one thing to note is that the frequency of returning to home at some point has increased over time. And that's what the figure on the slide shows. It's the rate of boomerang children. You can see the increase in living with parents around the time of the 2008 economic recession. So much of this is due to financial issues. However, it is also related to young adults pursuing education for more years than before, and is also related to a more positive relationship with parents. That these kids like their parents perhaps more than, and get along with their parents, and don't mind living with their parents more than previous generations. So, when they're given a choice between living with roommates versus parents, they're more likely to choose parents than previous generations. And also it's a reflection of society's general acceptance of this living situation. It's almost like a well-known issue that people in their 20s often move back in with parents. Now, children's success in life does influence their midlife parents' sense of well-being. So adult children's problems like not meeting career or relationship goals is associated with poor well-being for parents. So they really do care about their children feeling successful in achieving these goals, and it can be difficult for parents to see their children not go through these milestones. And generally speaking, there's a continuity in the parent-child relationships through the lifespan. So warmth and support in childhood predicts parents and children who are, in better contact and closer in early adulthood. Grandparenthood is becoming significant, coming significantly later in life, and this is because of the later ages of childbirth as well. So if the parent is waiting to have a baby, this means that their parent has to wait to become a grandparent. And the figure on the slide shows this trend over time. Grandparent involvement is associated with child well-being, adolescent adjustment, and it also improves life satisfaction in the grandparent. Now, the relationship between grandparent and grandchild is influenced by several factors. So same sex, so gender, right, grandmothers and granddaughters versus grandfathers and grandsons are more likely to be close. Also, geographic proximity makes sense. How close they are, they're more likely to be involved with their grandchildren. Socioeconomic status, and also just cultural views about how close-knit and cohesive families should be can influence involvement of grandparents. Now, you may have heard this term before, sandwich generation. This is the idea that midlife adults are scrambling to meet the needs of dependent children and then also frail elderly parents. But turns out this might not be an accurate picture. It may only be about 15% of midlife adults who are taking care of a parent older than 65 and also raising a young child. Now, this statistic is from 2012, so perhaps it has changed in recent years, so keep an eye out for updated statistics. Most midlife parents have adult children, and so as their parents age, they may have to start considering the care, what they will do with their parents. Adult children, the care that adult children provide their aging parents is influenced by the parent-child relationship, family circumstances, and also ethnicity. So the cultural value of familialism, of being close and supportive of your family, this obligation to take care of older generations, increases their likelihood of caring for elderly parents. Parents and adult children who have a lifetime of close and positive relations tend to remain close. So these adult children are more likely to provide assistance than those whose family relations are less positive. But there are cases of there being a weak parent-child relationship. And so in this case, sometimes the child is caring for the parent just out of this sense of duty, like they're obligated to do so. Now, there are some career and economic costs of giving care for aging parents. They sometimes have to reduce their work hours or may even have to leave the workforce in order to care for an aging parent, which then causes a loss of income and resources and also space in the home. Now, in addition to families, we also have important social relationships with our peers throughout our lives. Our neighbors, work colleagues, classmates, other acquaintances, they're all considered our peers. Now, social interactions with our peers begin in childhood, and they usually center around play, right? It could be rough and tumble play like running and climbing and chasing and play fighting. This exercises gross motor skills and helps the development of muscle strength and control, and is more common in males. Whereas sociodramatic play involves taking on roles and acting out stories and themes like playing house or playing school. And in this type of play, children learn to explain their ideas and emotions. This can begin in toddlerhood. Now, play varies by culture. Collectivistic cultures often emphasize cooperation, like acting out scripts together, like going to the market and sharing a vegetable. Whereas Western individualist cultures tend to play competitive games like hide and seek or dodgeball. So we do see differences in the types of play depending on culture. Children tend to choose friends who are like them in interests, in play preferences, and demographics. Friendships tend to remain stable from middle childhood into adolescence. However, friendships may come and go as children develop new interests, competencies, and values. For example, children who learn they're fairly athletic are more likely to make new friends who are also athletic. So sometimes friendships end as other friendships are developed because of these changing interests. Friendship disillusion, so the ending of a friendship, may have serious consequences for children if they're unable to replace that friendship. And it can be associated with depression, loneliness, guilt, anger, anxiety, or even acting out. Many children replace the lost or ended friendships with new friendships. However, an estimated 15% of children are chronically friendless or consistently without a mutual best friend. And this is indicative of problems or loneliness and maybe a sign of anxiety or fear. However, it's important to note that some children, they may just prefer solitude and want to be alone. So in regards to peer acceptance, we have used these terms, or you may be familiar with these terms of popularity or kids who are rejected. This is relating to how much or the degree to which a child is viewed as a worthy social partner by peers. Popular children are children who are valued by their peers, and they tend to have a variety of positive characteristics. They tend to be more helpful, be perceived as more trustworthy, they're assertive, and they have pro-social habits, so they tend to help others and do good for others. They're also more skilled in emotion regulation, being able to control their emotions, and they're better able at processing social information. Kids who are rejected are those who are disliked and shunned by peers. They're kind of excluded from peer groups. There are two patterns of behavior, either the rejected kids who are aggressive or that are withdrawn. So the aggressive rejected children tend to be very confrontational and hostile toward others. They're very impulsive and hyperactive. So because of that aggressiveness, they're rejected from most social groups. Those who are withdrawn rejected, they're socially withdrawn, passive, timid, anxious, socially awkward. And so they are kind of the quiet, neglected ones, and kids don't necessarily reach out to develop those friendships. Adolescent friendships are characterized by intimacy, self-disclosure, trust, and loyalty. Really getting to know someone on a much closer level and share your secrets and talk about your inner thoughts and desires. Boys tend to get together for activities like sports and competitive games, whereas girls tend to prefer one-on-one interactions and often spend their time together just talking and discussing things. Similarity does characterize adolescent friendships. So those who are more similar in demographics, even ethnicity and age, and also interests, and also psychological and developmental characteristics predict the likelihood of becoming friends. Now, most adolescents experience pressure to conform to peer norms, and this peaks at age 14, declines through age 18. So this desire to be like others, to do what others are doing, and it can influence them in negative ways, like more likely to do risky behaviors because other kids are doing risky behaviors and bad things. But then also it can be positive. There can be pressure to engage in pro-social positive behaviors like volunteering or helping others. Now, we've got two different types of groups that we see emerge in adolescence. Cliques are close-knit friendship groups that really share similarities, usually only about five members. So these are just groups of friends that stick together, and of course they can sometimes be a bit changing over time and sometimes tumultuous. Crowds instead are larger and looser groups based on shared characteristics, interests, and reputation. So crowd membership is based on an adolescent's image or the reputation among peers. And we see different groups that you might be familiar with, like the popular kids or the athletes, the academics, the deviants, or maybe just normal kids. So that can create different crowds that a person may identify with in adolescence. Now, dating often emerges in adolescence. Dating is the establishing of romantic relationships, which is very common in the US for adolescents. And it varies by culture. Youth in Western societies tend to date earlier than those in Asian cultures. But often the purpose of dating is simply to have a relationship. Dating is associated with many positive outcomes and some negative ones. So positive outcomes, it's associated with feeling good about oneself, a positive self-concept, positive expectations for success in future relationships. They feel like they can find someone to be with and make a relationship work. They have fewer feelings of alienation, so they feel more sense of belonging. And also it's related to good health. Negative is related to early dating is associated with more alcohol and substance use, smoking, delinquency, low academic competence, and also depression. So we've got some positives and some negatives. Adult friendships tend to be based on similarity. Close friendships are based on reciprocity, this emotional give and take that entails intimacy, companionship, and support, and behaviors such as sharing, exchanging favors, and giving advice. Friendships change over the course of adulthood. Single young adults rely more heavily on friendships because they're their primary source of help and emotional connection. In middle adulthood, as adults establish careers, they have less time for friends, but are still considered important to them. And in older adulthood, there's more time for leisure activities, so friendships often become more centered on these particular leisure activities like bingo and whatnot. Social interaction tends to decline in older adulthood, accounted for by several perspectives, some of which have more support than others. The first one being disengagement theory. Older adults disengage from society as they anticipate death. And at the same time, society disengages from them. They give up social roles and turn inward, reflecting upon the life that they've had. This may also minimize the impact of their death on society because they've removed themselves from these critical roles. However, really the central tenet is just not true. Most older adults prefer to remain active and engaged with others, so we don't have much support in this disengagement theory. Activity theory suggests that the declines in social interaction are not a result of elders' desires, but are instead a function of social barriers to engagement. When they lose roles due to retirement or disability, they fail to attempt to replace lost roles in an effort to stay active and busy. For example, volunteer work can replace career roles and protect against decline in health and psychological well-being. And the next perspective is continuity theory, that successful aging entails not simply remaining active, but maintaining a sense of consistency in oneself across the past into the future. And this makes sense that they want to maintain these roles and not lose the sense of identity and who they are, but it has to change over time with their changing abilities and what they can do. So the next one here is the socio-emotional selectivity theory. This is the idea that older adults become increasingly motivated to derive emotional meaning from life and thereby cultivate emotionally close relationships, but then also disengage from more peripheral or less important social ties. So even though there's a reduction in the number of social relationships, they focus more on the most important personal relationships, and they develop quantity over quality. And this is associated with more positive emotional outcomes. I hope you too can find some good positive emotional, social interactions with others and develop these friendships and enjoy them lifelong.